It is the 31st of January, 1858. On the banks of the River Thames in London, thousands have gathered staring in awe at a colossus of iron that looms over them. Towering from the shoreline stands a Leviathan, a ship of 19,000 tons, the obsession of its creator. After multiple failed attempts, the vessel is finally coaxed into the water, where its vast body will be completed afloat. A year later, on board that very ship, the same man suffers a stroke. He dies soon after never witnessing the maiden voyage of what was, at the time, the largest ship ever constructed. His name, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, history's greatest engineer.
My beloved humanity, ascent.
He was born on April 9, 1806 on the island of Portsea, now part of Portsmouth, on the southern coast of England. Brunel's father, Marc Brunel, was born in 1769 in Normandy, France. While Marc's father had hoped his son would become a priest, Marc defied expectations. He chose engineering and joined the French Navy. But the French Revolution of 1789 threw his world into chaos. Like tens of thousands of royalists and conservative refugees, Marc fled France in 1793, seeking safety in the newly independent United States. By 1796, Marc had become chief engineer of New York City, a key role during a transformative period in which New York began to overtake Philadelphia as America's premier urban center. Before fleeing France, Marc had fallen in love with Sophia Kingdom, a young Englishwoman working as a governess in Rouen, Normandy. She had been stranded in France when war broke out between Britain and France. Marc was forced to leave Sophia behind, but the two continued to correspond. After Sophia returned to England in 1795, Marc longed to join her. That opportunity came in 1798 during a dinner with Alexander Hamilton, one of America's founding fathers. Marc learned that the British Navy was struggling to source enough wooden pulley blocks for ship rigging. Seizing the moment, Marc designed a machine to automate their production. In early 1799, he sailed to England carrying both his designs and a letter of introduction from Hamilton to George Spencer, the First Lord of the Admiralty. Upon arrival, Marc wasted no time. By November 1799, he reunited with Sophia and married her at St. Andrew's Church in Holborn, London. Their marriage had nearly never happened. After Marc escaped France, Sophia remained behind even as war between Britain and France dragged on from 1792. As a British national, she was eventually arrested in October 1793 when the revolutionary French government detained all foreign nationals suspected of espionage. She was only released after Maximilien Robespierre, the radical Jacobin leader, was overthrown in the Thermidorian reaction of August 1794. A less radical regime took power, and Sophia was able to return to England, staying with her brother in London until Marc returned and they wed. Between 1800 and 1805, the couple had two daughters, Sophia and Emma. In April 1806, they welcomed their only son, giving him a rare and powerful name, Isambard Kingdom. In 1802, the family moved to Portsmouth, after Marc's pulley block designs won the support of Sir Samuel Bentham, Inspector General of Naval Works, and the younger brother of philosopher Jeremy Bentham. There, at the naval dockyard, a factory was built where Marc oversaw the manufacturing process. Isambard grew up in an age of sweeping transformation. The French Revolutionary Wars, which had separated his parents, evolved into the Napoleonic Wars, a time when Europe itself seemed in constant upheaval. At first, many in England welcomed the early French Revolution. The promise of constitutional monarchy and liberal reform had sparked admiration. But by January 1793, the execution of King Louis XVI shattered that sympathy. Britain declared war. Austria and Prussia had already entered conflict with France in 1792, and the continent would remain at war for more than 2 decades until 1815. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power as first consul in 1799 and crowned himself emperor by 1804. Between 1805 and 1807, he defeated the great land powers Austria, Prussia, Russia, and came to dominate the European mainland. Across the Channel, only Britain remained unbowed. The Royal Navy blockaded French ports, foiling Napoleon's dreams of invasion. In October 1805, the British Navy, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, defeated a combined Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar, cementing Britain's maritime supremacy. That victory ensured Britain's control over global trade routes, just as the Industrial Revolution was beginning to reshape its economy. From the 1770s, Britain had surged ahead through innovation. The rise of factories, the division of labor, and the harnessing of steam power made production faster and cheaper. Though France was arguably ahead in science and theory, British industrialists had stronger political support and access to capital. Despite the burdens of war, Britain escaped the devastation ravaging the continent. Its economy kept growing, and during the first half of the 19th century, Britain would become the industrial leader of the world. And Brunel, he would be at the heart of that revolution. In 1808, when Isambard was 2 years old, the family moved to Chelsea in southwest London, where they would live for almost 2 decades. Mark Brunel's work on pulley blocks made his reputation in England, and in 1808 he built a sawmill at Battersea, across the Thames from Chelsea, where he implemented measures to increase the efficiency of timber processing. The following year, he began to mass-produce boots for poorly equipped British soldiers, and in 1812 he was commissioned by the Royal Navy to build a sawmill at the Chatham Dockyard in Kent. Despite his contribution to the war effort, Brunel was often not paid the full amount he had been promised by the British government, and the family's precarious financial situation would eventually lead to disaster. As the only son of the family, young Isambard was brought up to follow in his father's footsteps. The young boy benefited from the close attention of his father, who taught him to draw at the age of 4 and the basics of Euclidean geometry at the age of 8. Mark was impressed by his son's abilities and sent him to a boarding school at Hove in Sussex, where he studied classics and made a survey of the town in his free time. He used his knowledge of engineering to astonish his classmates by predicting the imminent collapse of poorly designed buildings. In 1815, peace was restored to Europe after Allied armies led by the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher defeated Napoleon decisively at the Battle of Waterloo in what is now Belgium. This was the second time Napoleon had been defeated, and this time the victors made sure he could never pose a threat to the peace of Europe again, exiling him to the utterly remote island of St. Helena in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. Mark Brunel was glad to see the restoration of the House of Bourbon to the French throne in the aftermath of Napoleon's demise, but he was now a British citizen and made no effort to return to his native land with his family. Nevertheless, he believed his son would benefit from a French education, and in 1820 the 14-year-old Isambard was sent off to France. The teenage Brunel was initially enrolled at the College of Caen in his father's native Normandy, now Caen University, before moving on to the Lycée Henri Quatre in Paris. In 1822, at the age of 16, Isambard spent several months working for the clockmaker Abraham Louis Breguet, who was impressed by the young man's inventive potential. Mark had hoped to send Isambard to the prestigious École Polytechnique in Paris, which Napoleon had transformed into one of the most advanced academies for military engineers anywhere in the world. But Isambard's English birth disqualified him from obtaining a position there. Therefore, he returned to England in August 1822 to become an assistant at his father's office at 16 years of age. During Isambard's absence in France, Mark Brunel had fallen into debt as a result of a series of failed projects that had run into trouble in a post-war environment in which his designs were no longer as necessary. He spent 3 months in debtor's prison in Southwark as a result, where the dutiful Sophia joined him and helped him with his work there. After his initial appeals to the government were unsuccessful, Mark sought assistance from Tsar Alexander I of Russia, who had been impressed by his work on pulley blocks more than a decade earlier and had invited him to St. Petersburg. After writing to the Tsar, Mark also went public with his criticisms of the British government for failing to pay him for his work during the war, and then incarcerating him for unpaid debts years later as though the debts were not really those of the government. Following the public outcry, Mark Brunel's influential political friends, including Lord Spencer and the Duke of Wellington, persuaded the government to pay him $5,000 to clear his debts in exchange for a promise to remain in England and not travel abroad to share his engineering ideas with other governments. The British were particularly keen to avoid him entering the employment of Russia at a time when the Great Game, The name for the rivalry between the Russians and the British in Central Asia was just beginning. Hence, after leaving prison, Mark Brunel returned to work with a wide range of projects. Young Isambard was involved in supervising operations at a Sheffield ironworks, which was making the iron for 2 suspension bridges in the French colony of Réunion in the Indian Ocean. Isambard was about to set out on his own engineering career at this time. It is worth briefly reflecting on the environment he would work in. While the Industrial Revolution had changed Britain, this first industrial revolution, as it is now termed, was quite limited in some respects. It had taken place in the half-century after 1770 and was primarily focused on revolutionizing the textile industry that formed the backbone of the British economy in those days. Factories had been set up to engage in textile production on a mass scale, and steam power was employed for the first time to reduce the need for sheer manpower. Coal mining had expanded accordingly to feed the new factories. However, it was not until the 1820s that a truly revolutionary period of engineering would begin in England. The first railway lines would be laid down in the late 1820s, and the 1830s and 1840s saw a revolution in transport as thousands of kilometers of railway line were laid down across Britain. Soon, people would begin wondering how the steam engines which propelled locomotives across land by burning coal could be employed to propel ships across the Atlantic Ocean. There were also all kinds of new innovations being introduced in the fields of metallurgy, though it would take until the mid-1850s until modern steel was first produced in England. Many people were already working in the 1820s on ways to manipulate iron and other metals to produce more durable metals. Stronger metals could hold greater loads, and this meant stronger bridges and other types of engineering. All of this would culminate in 1851 in the Crystal Palace exhibition in London, a fair showcasing many thousands of pieces of new engineering and inventions. A few years later, plans to develop a modern sewerage system for London were being initiated. Thus, the period from the 1820s to the 1850s was in many ways an engineering revolution after the first industrial revolution. Isambard Kingdom Brunel would be absolutely central to this engineering revolution. The young Brunel spent much of his time in the 1820s experimenting with the gas engine. At a meeting of the Royal Society in London, Mark Brunel listened to a lecture by its president, Sir Humphrey Davy, who noted that Michael Faraday had recently invented a method to liquefy natural gases under pressure. Davy suggested that by using a small amount of heat to convert liquefied carbon dioxide back into gas, it was possible to generate energy much more efficiently than by using steam. Mark Brunel decided to investigate the feasibility of such an engine. But despite some encouraging experiments, the difficulties involved in the casting of metal strong enough to withstand the high pressures involved eventually caused the project to be abandoned. At around the same time, the French scientist Sadi Carnot was in the process of formulating the first law of thermodynamics, which demonstrated that energy could not be created or destroyed, only transformed from one state to another. This meant that Davy's concept was physically impossible, but British engineers were unaware of Carnot's work for decades. Despite the failure of the gas engine, Mark Brunel saw greater success in patenting an improved steam engine which ran more efficiently. Isambard watched all of these developments closely as he began to enter his late teens. While Isambard would one day eclipse his father's achievements, in the 1820s he was still very much learning under his guidance. Father and son would embark on their greatest collaboration in June 1824 when Mark Brunel was appointed chief engineer of the Thames Tunnel Company. For centuries, the only crossing over the River Thames in London had been London Bridge, but growing demands from the city's booming population during the 18th century had prompted the construction of several additional bridges upstream. However, a new crossing was now needed, east of London Bridge, where the port and dockyards were located. A bridge in this location was out of the question. It would block tall sailing ships from reaching London's vital docks. In 1805, Richard Trevithick, a mining engineer best known for his pioneering work on steam locomotives, led a team of Cornish miners in an effort to tunnel under the river in East London. These miners were skilled at working with hard rock, but found themselves at a loss when dealing with the soft clay beneath the Thames. By 1809, the effort had been abandoned. Trevithick declared it was impossible to tunnel under the Thames, but Mark Brunel, ever the innovator, saw an opportunity. By 1818, he had patented a revolutionary tunneling shield. a protective cast iron frame that would safeguard workers as they excavated the tunnel face. After surveying the proposed route between Wapping on the north bank and Rotherhithe on the south, Mark revised his shield design into a rectangular frame capable of holding 12 men at once. Work commenced in 1825. Soon, the shield was in place beneath the riverbed. Mark had estimated the entire job would take 3 years. In the end, it would take 6 times as long. Initially, Isambard served as assistant engineer, but following the resignation of resident engineer William Armstrong, the 20-year-old Brunel was promoted to the top role in January 1827. Over the next 18 months, Isambard worked closely with 2 young assistants, Richard Beamish and William Gravitt. By now in his 50s, Mark focused on directing the overall vision and dealing with the tunnel company's unruly board of directors, leaving day-to-day operations underground to his son and the team. Brunel worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week in harsh and dangerous conditions. By the spring of 1827, almost 500 men were employed on the project. The tunnel was nearly halfway completed, around 600 feet, or 180 meters. Then came disaster. On 18th May 1827, the riverbed collapsed, causing the Thames to flood the entire tunnel. Thanks to the quick thinking of Isambard and Gravitt, no lives were lost. Despite the cramped, miserable conditions, the company directors tried to salvage their financial position by selling admission tickets, turning the half-finished tunnel into a tourist attraction, showcasing modern engineering. In November 1827, Isambard hosted a lavish dinner party for 50 guests inside the tunnel. Richard Beamish arranged for a military band from his former unit, the Coldstream Guards, to provide live music. But only 2 months later, in January 1828, tragedy struck again. As the tunnel reached its halfway mark, it flooded once more. This time, 6 workers died, and Brunel himself narrowly escaped drowning, saved by Beamish. Severely shaken, Isambard spent months recovering from the experience. The tunnel project came to a halt. It wouldn't resume for another 7 years until 1835, when Mark managed to raise enough capital to restart construction. Despite ongoing flooding problems, the tunnel was finally opened to the public on 25 March 1843. By that point, Mark Brunel had been knighted by Queen Victoria in 1841 in recognition of his role in building the world's first underwater tunnel, a structure that was later converted into a rail tunnel, and which still forms part of London's railway network to this day. Though Isambard played no further role in completing the Thames Tunnel, the experience had already shaped him. It gave him hard-won experience in project management, and more importantly in leading men in high-risk situations. And there was one more lesson. Having watched his father forced to compromise on safety by directors more concerned with money than lives, Brunel made himself a promise. He would never allow financiers to override his own judgment in engineering matters. Brunel struggled with his health throughout 1828 and made several trips to France. A combination of poor physical health, the near-death experience while working on the Thames Tunnel, and the cessation of tunnel works appeared to have a profound effect on Brunel's psychological state during this period. The dark sentiments he conveyed to friends were in stark contrast to the grandiose ambition he confided in a private journal begun in October 1827 to one day command a fleet of steamboats in the Royal Navy and, in his words, take some island or fortified town. He also shared reflections on the women in his life, notably mentioning Ellen Hume, a young lady from Manchester whom he had apparently known for almost 7 years at the time of the diary entry. Though he considered proposing marriage, by 1829 he had resolved not to, even though his romantic feelings for her seemed undiminished. Throughout the diary, Brunel alluded to his habit of imagining what he called castles in the air, personal dreams and professional ventures that he feared might never be realized. While he and his father continued trying to revive the tunnel project and experimented with the gas engine, Brunel entered a design competition for a bridge across the Avon Gorge near Clifton, a suburb of Bristol. Having never designed a bridge before, he sought advice from his father. Mark Brunel believed the gorge was too wide for a single span and proposed a Chinese-style pagoda rising from the gorge floor to support the structure. Isambard ultimately rejected the idea, and in November 1829 submitted 4 variations of a single-span design around 270 meters. though the drawings clearly bore his father's influence. The competition's judge, Thomas Telford, president of the Institute of Civil Engineers, had recently completed the Menai Suspension Bridge in Wales, linking Anglesey to the mainland. Telford rejected all submissions and instead presented his own design, featuring two massive towers each rising over 70 meters above the gorge. Brunel was outraged by what he perceived as blatant corruption, and wrote to the committee arguing that Telford's towers were too heavy and would inevitably collapse. In 1830, the Bridge Committee agreed that Telford's design was too expensive and reopened the competition with new judges. Although Brunel knew his original proposals were sound, he revised them, suggesting a large abutment on the western bank to shorten the span to 200 meters. Meanwhile, in late 1830, Brunel received a commission to design an observatory for astronomer Sir James South at his Kensington residence. Brunel, a keen admirer of astronomy and friend of Sir John Herschel, whose father William had discovered Uranus in 1781, welcomed the project. The observatory was completed in May 1831. Soon afterward, however, South complained that the costs had far exceeded Brunel's initial estimate. An anonymous article in the Athenaeum Journal criticized Brunel's mechanical shutters, dismissing the project as this absurd project has no other object than the display of a tour de force. Deeply wounded, Brunel considered suing for libel on the advice of his friend Charles Babbage, the mathematician and computing pioneer, but ultimately dropped the matter. Despite the Bristol Bridge Committee once again rejecting his proposals for the Avon Gorge, Brunel refused to concede defeat. In March 1831, he traveled to Bristol, met with the judging panel, and successfully persuaded them to adopt his design, arguing it was the most structurally efficient solution. Construction began in July 1831. At just 25 years old, Brunel was poised for engineering stardom. But within months, the project ran into serious complications, beyond the usual financial and technical hurdles. In late October 1831, Bristol was engulfed in 3 days of riots following the House of Lords' rejection of the first version of the Great Reform Bill legislation, aimed at expanding the vote in a Britain where, in the early 1800s, only wealthy men could cast ballots. With a population of over 100,000, Bristol was a hotbed of support for electoral reform. At the time, only about 6,000 residents had the right to vote. The Reform Bill, championed by Earl Grey's Whig government, sought to widen the franchise and adjust parliamentary representation to reflect the growth of industrial cities. The bill eventually became law in June 1832, and during that year's general election, Brunel campaigned vigorously for his brother-in-law and closest friend, Benjamin Hawes, helping him win a seat as MP for Lambeth in South London. But the political chaos had already taken its toll. Work on the suspension bridge in Bristol was suspended. Meanwhile, Brunel was pursuing other commissions. In November 1831, he was hired to design docks at the mouth of the River Wear in northeast England, a key coal export region. He settled on Monk Wearmouth on the river's north bank in Sunderland. He then traveled to Manchester, visited the Hume family, and took a ride on the newly opened Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which impressed him deeply. He predicted trains would soon carry passengers at 45 miles per hour, smoothly and efficiently. However, when he returned to London to present his dock plans, Parliament rejected them as too expensive. In summer 1832, his Bristol contact, Nicholas Roche, invited him to assess the city harbor. Once the most important port on England's west coast, Bristol had lost ground to Liverpool, whose docks could accommodate much larger vessels. Though a floating harbor had been created in the early 1800s to allow ships to stay afloat at low tide, it had begun to silt up badly. In a report submitted in late August, Brunel recommended dredging to clear the silt and improving water flow to prevent future buildup. Most of his suggestions were deemed too costly, but small improvements were made. Brunel also concluded the harbor was too small, but city merchants resisted relocating it from the city center. Over the coming decades, Brunel would repeatedly clash with Bristol's port authorities. In February 1833, Roche alerted Brunel to a proposed railway line connecting London to Bristol, backed by directors from the Clifton Suspension Bridge Company. Roche explained that the committee would accept the cheapest viable proposal. Brunel was infuriated by what he saw as short-sighted thrift, and told them his plan wouldn't be the cheapest, but it would be the best. His argument prevailed. He was commissioned to survey the route, traveling back and forth between London and Bristol through rugged terrain, completing the survey within weeks. In July, a new London-based committee was established to work with the Bristol group, and at their first joint meeting in August 1833, Brunel was officially appointed engineer of what would become the Great Western Railway, though he still occasionally sought his father's advice. By now, Brunel had cemented his status as an independent engineer. He envisioned a national railway network, one that would let people travel long distances swiftly and affordably. In September, Brunel was tasked with conducting a more detailed survey, while the directors began raising capital for parliamentary approval. Leading the fundraising was Charles Saunders, secretary of the London Committee and soon a close collaborator. When Parliament reconvened that autumn, the directors initially sought approval for 2 short segments from Bristol to Bath and London to Reading. They met resistance from landowners, farmers, and even Eton College, which worried the railway's proximity would corrupt its students by granting easy access to London's temptations. Brunel spent 11 days giving evidence before the committee. His testimony helped the bill pass the House of Commons, though some critics mocked the proposal as being neither Great Western nor a railway. After Brunel firmly refuted the claims, the bill passed both houses of Parliament, and by the very end of August 1835, the plans for the Great Western Railway Act received royal assent from King William IV. Just 2 weeks later, Brunel informed the company directors of his intent to build the railway to a broad gauge in order to offer passengers a greater degree of comfort, and he won their full approval. In December 1835, the directors abandoned the planned terminus at Euston, instead opting for temporary station facilities at Paddington in West London, since the London and Birmingham Railway was reluctant to connect with the Great Western due to its different gauge. As Brunel approached his 30th birthday in April 1836, everything seemed to be going his way. Not only had construction begun on the Great Western Railway, but the Thames Tunnel was revived, and his revised designs for the Monk-Wearmouth docks also secured parliamentary approval. A few months later, work even resumed on the long-delayed Clifton Suspension Bridge. This rapid string of professional successes soon influenced Brunel's personal life. Since 1832, he had been a frequent visitor to Kensington House, the residence of William Horsley, a renowned musician and composer. Horsley's 5 children included many talented artists and musicians, but Brunel was especially drawn to Mary Horsley, the 19-year-old eldest daughter. Strikingly beautiful, though not sharing her siblings' artistic flair, Mary had caught Brunel's eye years earlier. By May 1836, confident in his financial stability, Brunel finally resolved to propose. They married that July, in a ceremony held in Kensington. Afterwards, the couple moved to a new home on Duke Street, beside St. James's Park in London. Even after the wedding, however, Brunel continued to prioritize his engineering work, while Mary often remained in the city to manage the household. Between 1837 and 1847, they would have 2 sons and a daughter. In fact, Brunel's ambition was already leaping beyond railways. Even before the Great Western Railway had received parliamentary approval in early 1835, he had shared a visionary idea with the company's directors. As the committee hesitated over the grand scale of the project, set to be the longest railway line in Britain to date, Brunel jokingly suggested that it still wasn't large enough. Why not? He proposed, also build a steamship named the Great Western to operate from Bristol to New York. This way, passengers could travel from London to New York, entirely aboard a train and steamship, both bearing the name Great Western. While the directors initially laughed, Brunel and his close associate Thomas Guppy took the concept seriously. They stayed up late that very night, sketching out the plan in earnest. By October 1835, the company directors gave their blessing, and in 1836, Brunel and Guppy officially founded the Great Western Steamship Company. Yet before work could begin on the steamship, Brunel faced fresh challenges with the railway itself. His choice of broad gauge and desire for high-speed travel demanded extremely flat terrain and a direct route. To achieve this, Brunel designed and built bridges, viaducts, and tunnels, all carefully constructed to maintain a straight and level course. The result earned a nickname, Brunel's billiards table. In pursuit of passenger comfort, Brunel also redesigned the track bed, choosing to support the rails with evenly spaced wooden planks rather than gravel and stone. Many of Brunel's bridges and viaducts became architectural landmarks in their own right, such as the Warncliffe Viaduct spanning the River Brent. But these magnificent structures added considerable cost to the project. The most demanding challenge was the Box Tunnel, where work commenced in September 1836. Workers struggled relentlessly to break through the hard limestone, while heavy rainfall caused flooding in the shafts. The tunnel, intended to be finished in 1837, wasn't completed until 1841, 4 years behind schedule. The railway was being constructed from both ends simultaneously, with two teams working toward the center. But progress on the western section lagged severely due to the tunnel delays. Even as the eastern segment advanced more smoothly, Brunel had hoped to design his own locomotives for the line, but early engines built to his specifications proved unreliable, cumbersome, and ultimately incompatible with his goal of high-speed travel. In August 1837, Brunel was fortunate to recruit Daniel Gooch, a 21-year-old engineer with hands-on experience building steam locomotives for Robert Stephenson in Newcastle, and an enthusiastic supporter of Brunel's broad-gauge system. After recognizing that the engines designed to Brunel's own specifications were not up to standard, Gooch convinced him to purchase two Stephenson-built locomotives, the North Star and the Morning Star, which had originally been intended for export to New Orleans. Stephenson agreed to convert both engines to run on the broad gauge before delivering them to the Great Western Railway. Though most of Brunel's energy at the time was focused on the Great Western Railway, in the summer of 1836, construction also began on the SS Great Western, the world's first major ocean-going steamship. It was being built at William Patterson's shipyard in Bristol. Patterson, together with Thomas Guppy and former Royal Navy officer Captain Christopher Claxton, formed a small advisory committee that provided expert guidance to Brunel throughout the project. But once again, Brunel's perennial critic, Dionysius Lardner, resurfaced this time to declare that a steamship would never be able to cross the Atlantic because the amount of coal needed would be so heavy that it would negate any advantage gained by using steam over wind power. Undeterred, Brunel observed that a larger hull would offer far greater internal volume, allowing for more coal and a much higher load-bearing capacity. In his view, bigger meant more efficient. He sent committee members to investigate steamship construction methods in the industrial ports of Glasgow and Liverpool, and returned with refinements to the engine design and a reinforced hull structure. The result was a paddle steamer over 70 meters long, the longest ship in the world at that time. Although Brunel and his team tried to keep the Great Western a secret to avoid tipping off rival companies, the British and American Steam Navigation Company of Liverpool had already taken notice. It was building its own transatlantic steamer, the British Queen, but when it saw how quickly Brunel was progressing, the company shelved the British Queen and instead tried to win the race by chartering a much smaller vessel, the Sirius. On 4 April 1838, the Sirius set sail for New York from the port of Cork in Southern Ireland. Just days earlier, the engine room of the SS Great Western had caught fire. Brunel, in what would be his second brush with death, fell from a burning ladder onto Christopher Claxton, who carried him to safety on the deck. After the blaze was extinguished, Brunel was taken ashore to recover. Nonetheless, repairs were completed swiftly, and on 8 April 1838, the Great Western began its maiden voyage across the Atlantic, racing to overtake the Sirius. Due to his injuries, Brunel could not join the journey. Still, the results were vindicating. Although the Sirius had a 4-day head start, the Great Western rapidly gained ground. The Sirius, running low on coal, was forced to slow down, and when it limped into New York on 22nd April, the Great Western arrived just hours later. While it had narrowly missed the honor of being the first steamship to cross the Atlantic, the Great Western was significantly faster and became the first regular transatlantic steamship service, making nearly 50 crossings between 1838 and 1846. Even as the Great Western ship entered service, the Great Western Railway faced more difficult prospects. In June 1838, a portion of the Eastern Line opened between London and Maidenhead, but Brunel's track modifications had not made the journey any smoother. After commissioning critical reviews of his designs, the GWR board proposed hiring a second engineer to work alongside Brunel, prompting him to threaten resignation. In January 1839, a powerful coalition of northern shareholders known as the Liverpool Group attempted to oust Brunel at a company meeting. However, he won the vote, retaining his position. Additional sections of the line were steadily being completed. Meanwhile, Gooch began developing the new Firefly-class locomotives, which could operate at 50 miles per hour. As the engine fleet outgrew the temporary Paddington facilities, Gooch proposed building a permanent maintenance depot near Swindon, a small hilltop market town in North Wiltshire. The depot officially opened in 1843. Brunel didn't just design the train sheds, but also housing and public buildings for railway workers. A hotel within the station provided refreshments for travelers, a pioneering example of modern travel hospitality, despite having missed several deadlines. On 3 June 1841, a Great Western Railway train finally ran a direct public service between London and Bristol, covering the 118-mile journey in 5.5 hours. Though the construction had gone significantly over budget, Brunel had once again defied his critics and cemented his reputation as a nationally celebrated engineer. And yet he almost didn't live long enough to enjoy it. In April 1843, while entertaining his sons, Brunel suffered his third near-death experience, accidentally swallowing a coin he had placed in his mouth during a party trick. Although Brunel was still able to breathe, the coin remained lodged in his windpipe, and his desperate efforts to remove it quickly made national headlines. In the end, it was his father who devised a solution, a contraption that turned Brunel upside down, allowing the coin to gradually slide out of his airway. By 1843, Brunel was already preparing to launch his second transatlantic steamship. From the start, the Great Western Steamship Company had envisioned building a sister ship to the SS Great Western, but Brunel's ambitions were far grander. As early as 1838, he had dispatched Patterson and Claxton to explore the possibility of constructing the vessel with an iron hull instead of a traditional wooden one. The report was favorable, and Brunel pressed ahead with plans for what would become the SS Great Britain, a ship that would weigh nearly 3,500 tons, making it 7 times larger than the biggest iron-hulled ships of its day. Construction officially began in July 1839, but the design continued to evolve, especially after Brunel observed the SS Archimedes arriving at the Bristol docks in early summer 1840, powered not by paddles, but by a screw propeller. Intrigued, Brunel sent Thomas Guppy to accompany the Archimedes on its journey to Liverpool. After reviewing Guppy's findings, Brunel convinced the company's directors that the SS Great Britain must be redesigned to incorporate this revolutionary new technology. His work soon drew the attention of the Admiralty in London, which invited Brunel to oversee trial runs of the screw propeller for potential use in the Royal Navy. Brunel accepted not just out of patriotic duty, but as an opportunity to collect invaluable data for the Great Britain's own performance. The trials proved successful. By July 1843, the SS Great Britain was structurally complete. Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, was the guest of honor as the massive ship glided out of dry dock and into the floating harbor, where its engines and boilers would be installed. By March 1844, the ship was fully equipped and ready to depart, but it was unable to leave the harbor. The Bristol Docks Company had failed to widen the harbor entrance adequately to accommodate the vessel's vast size. As a result, the ship remained trapped for months. Finally, in January 1845, the Great Britain left Bristol and made its way to Blackwall in London to be furnished and fully fitted. By July 1845, the ship embarked on its maiden transatlantic crossing, completing the journey in less than 15 days, a remarkable feat. However, in September of the same year, the ship encountered serious trouble. During a voyage, her captain Hoskin became disoriented in the heavy rain and lost his way. The ship had run aground off the northern coast of Ireland, and all efforts to free it proved futile. Though the iron hull remained largely intact, Captain Hoskin had effectively declared the vessel a loss in his report to the company. At the time, Brunel was fully absorbed in work on the Great Western Railway's branch lines and wasn't able to travel to Ireland until December 1846. When he finally arrived and saw the state-of-the-art vessel left to rot, he was furious, writing that it was lying like a useless saucepan kicking about on the most exposed shore you can imagine. Following a lengthy salvage operation, the ship was eventually towed to Liverpool, but the Great Western Steamship Company had already gone bankrupt, and the ship's fittings were removed. In 1851, the once revolutionary SS Great Britain was sold for a fraction of its original cost. Yet, This disaster did little to harm either the reputation or the fortunes of the now 39-year-old Isambard Kingdom Brunel. As the chief engineer of the Great Western Railway and its expanding web of branch lines, he continued to pursue innovation. Believing steam power to be both dirty and costly, Brunel began exploring alternatives. During a visit to Kingstown, now Dunlaoghaire on Ireland's east coast in 1844, he witnessed the trial of an atmospheric railway powered solely by air pressure. Intrigued, Brunel began testing the concept on a segment of the South Devon Railway between Exeter and Teignmouth, despite warnings from both Daniel Gooch and the Stevensons that the technology was doomed. After considerable delays, a section of the line was finally opened in September 1847. But Brunel's atmospheric railway barely lasted a year. Persistent engineering challenges such as leaky valves, maintenance difficulties, and the cost of operation proved insurmountable. The South Devon directors opted to revert to conventional steam locomotives. Still, Ireland remained central in Brunel's railway ambitions. Following the successful London-Bristol line and the expansion into Wales, Brunel envisioned a ferry link between Fishguard in southwest Wales and Rosslare in southeast Ireland. From there, a railway would connect Wexford to Dublin along the eastern coast. He was appointed engineer of the Waterford, Wexford, Wicklow, and Dublin Railway, but like many of his grander plans, the project stalled. Over the next decade, only small stretches of track were completed, another case where Brunel's vision outpaced the reality of economic and political conditions. It didn't help that Ireland was descending into famine and chaos, triggered in part by the potato blight, a pathogen ironically carried on the steamships Brunel had once so proudly designed. Meanwhile, his international reputation soared. Brunel was hired by the Kingdom of Piedmont in northern Italy to design a railway connecting Turin to Genoa, and eventually on to Milan. Despite 3 personal visits to Italy to survey the route, Brunel's frustration with local bureaucracy led him to withdraw from the project. Instead, between 1845 and 1848, he worked on a short rail line in Tuscany. By the 1850s, he had become a consultant to railway initiatives across the globe, including the East Bengal Line in India and multiple projects in Australia, securing his legacy as a global engineering force. Back in Britain, Brunel was now embroiled in the Gauge War, a national conflict over rail width standards. His beloved broad gauge dominated southwest England and Wales, but as it crept into the Midlands, it came into conflict with the more common narrow gauge networks. At Gloucester, the lack of standardization created a logistical nightmare. Passengers had to switch trains across platforms, and cargo had to be physically offloaded and reloaded between incompatible trains. In July 1845, the government established a royal commission to take expert testimony and determine a standardized gauge for Britain's railways, a decision that would carry immense consequences for Brunel's life's work. Brunel firmly championed the broad gauge, arguing it was smoother, faster, and more efficient, and he remained convinced that his rivals would ultimately be compelled to adopt it. To prove his point, he proposed a series of performance trials. In December, a broad-gauge locomotive ran the line from Paddington to Didcot, hauling 80 tons of freight at an average speed of 53 miles per hour. Meanwhile, a Stevenson-built narrow-gauge engine derailed at the same speed, carrying just 50 tons. Despite this clear technical win, the Royal Commission ruled in favor of the narrow gauge, citing the fact that there were already 1901 miles of narrow gauge track in Britain, compared to just 274 miles of Brunel's broader system. Stevenson's first-mover advantage proved decisive, but Brunel did not back down. His rearguard action led to Parliament including a clause that allowed for the continued use of the broad gauge even while standardizing on the 4-foot, 8.5-inch gauge. Nonetheless, the incompatibility between the two systems was inefficient, and eventually, even the Great Western Railway would switch to narrow gauge. Out of respect, the company delayed this conversion until after Brunel's death, beginning the painstaking replacement work during the 1860s. For more than a decade, Brunel's career had been dominated by railways, but in 1847, the railway bubble burst, bringing to an end the frenzied railway mania, a decade-long boom of overinvestment that suddenly collapsed into bust. Disillusioned, Brunel purchased land in Barton, near Torquay in Devon. He intended to build a grand retirement home. styled like a French chateau. But this would be only a partial retreat. Brunel was still a relatively young man, and his creative drive remained undiminished. He went on to design landmark structures, including the Royal Albert Bridge over the River Tamar, connecting Plymouth and Saltash as part of the Great Western Railway. Due to financial hurdles, construction didn't start until 1854, and the bridge was only completed in 1858, shortly before his death. Brunel also played a key role in the 1851 Great Exhibition in London's Hyde Park, serving as a judge in the civil engineering category. Inspired by Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace, Brunel designed a new station for Paddington, a majestic fusion of iron and glass which endures today as one of London's most iconic train stations. At that very exhibition, Brunel reconnected with Scottish shipbuilder John Scott Russell, presenting him with plans for his most audacious project, yet a gigantic vessel, nearly 200 meters long, capable of carrying enough coal to reach Australia without the need to resupply. He secured backing from the Eastern Steam Navigation Company to build what would become the SS Great Eastern, although the ship would be constructed at Scott Russell Shipyard in Millwall, London. The project placed enormous strain on their working relationship. Brunel, known for his strict specifications, was unaccustomed to shipbuilders like Russell who treated plans with more flexibility. Then, in February 1855, a request arrived from the Deputy Secretary at War, none other than Brunel's brother-in-law, Ben Hawes. The British government needed a new hospital for wounded soldiers in the Crimean War, where Britain and France had allied with the Ottoman Empire to resist Russian expansion in the Black Sea. Hawes had come under fire from Florence Nightingale, who accused him of ignoring her urgent concerns about poor sanitation in field hospitals, conditions that spread disease and caused countless avoidable deaths. Brunel sprang into action. Within 6 days, he produced a prefabricated hospital design that implemented Nightingale's recommendations on ventilation and hygiene. The components were shipped to Renkioi, in modern-day Turkey, in May, and the hospital opened that July. Nightingale was elated with the result. Although the hospital operated only for a brief period, the war ended in January 1856. It played a key role in reducing fatalities and vindicated her criticisms. The rest of Brunel's life would be consumed by the SS Great Eastern, a project of monumental scale. Under its final specifications, the ship would stretch over 211 meters, capable of transporting 4,000 passengers, many of whom would occupy interior cabins with artificial lighting and ventilation, a novelty at the time. But the immense size of the vessel posed new challenges. A conventional launch tipping the ship perpendicular to the river would cause it to run aground on the opposite bank. Instead, the ship had to be constructed parallel to the waterway, inventing an entirely new kind of sideways launch system. While Scott Russell had constructed his ships using traditional wooden shipbuilding techniques, Brunel once again broke convention, designing a revolutionary double hull, held together by bulkheads that provided immense strength without adding unnecessary weight. These twin hulls were assembled from standardized steel plates, riveted firmly into place. But as construction moved forward, the relationship between Brunel and Scott Russell deteriorated rapidly. Brunel grew increasingly suspicious that Russell was attempting to claim credit for the ship's design. A perfect storm of challenges followed a surge in iron prices during the Crimean War, fires in the shipyard, and Brunel's refusal to release regular payments, all of which drove Scott Russell into severe financial trouble. Unknown to Brunel, Russell had even mortgaged the shipyard. When his bank took over the premises, work ground to a halt. Although Brunel attempted to take full control of the project, Russell pushed back, eager to complete the hull and paddle boxes himself. Reluctantly, Brunel allowed it. Eventually, Russell's creditors agreed to lease the shipyard to the Eastern Steam Company, and by June, the massive vessel's construction was effectively complete. But one final hurdle remained: launching the ship. Despite a complex system of pulleys, winches, and hydraulic rams, the behemoth refused to budge more than a few inches at a time. After 4 failed attempts in November, Brunel turned to an unlikely advisor, his old rival, Robert Stephenson, who recommended adding more hydraulic power. Brunel agreed, and by the end of January 1858, the SS Great Eastern finally slid into the water with the aid of 18 hydraulic rams. Despite this triumph, The project had drained the Eastern Steam Company to the point of collapse. Some directors wanted nothing more to do with the ship. A new company, the Great Ship Company, was formed by the remaining backers to take over the vessel. The SS Great Eastern was an engineering marvel, but the stress of its construction, combined with the financial strain that haunted many of Brunel's grandest ventures, took a devastating toll on his health. In search of rest, Brunel took an extended retreat to the south of France from May to September. But upon his return to London, he was horrified to discover that the ship still had not been fitted out. Later that year, he was diagnosed with nephritis, a painful inflammation of the kidneys. That winter, he joined his family on a trip to Egypt. But by the time he returned to England in May 1859, he was a shadow of his former self. Though he continued to supervise the fitting out of the ship, he was too frail to attend its completion ceremony. On September 5th, he suffered a stroke and was taken home. Just days later, the Great Eastern embarked on her maiden voyage without Brunel. Tragically, with no one clearly assigned overall authority during the voyage, disaster struck. On September 9th, the ship's forward funnel exploded, killing 5 coal stokers. Bedridden, Brunel was devastated by the news. It proved to be the final blow. On the evening of September 15, 1859, Isambard Kingdom Brunel passed away. He was just 53 years old. 5 days later, he was laid to rest at Kensal Green Cemetery in London. Though the SS Great Eastern made a successful transatlantic crossing in June 1860, the Great Ship Company couldn't afford to operate the Australia route as Brunel had envisioned. After being sold in 1865, the ship was repurposed to lay the first transatlantic telegraph cables. After Brunel's death, his peers at the Institute of Civil Engineers resolved to honor his legacy by completing the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which had remained unfinished since 1843. With slight modifications, the bridge was finally completed in 1864. Upon hearing of Brunel's passing, Daniel Gooch wrote in his diary, "By his death, the greatest of England's engineers was lost, the man with the greatest originality of thought and power of execution, bold in his plans but right. The commercial world thought him extravagant, but although he was so, great things are not done by those who sit down and count the cost of every thought and act." Brunel's legacy still shapes Britain today. Many of his creations remain in use: the Thames Tunnel, Clifton Suspension Bridge, Great Western Railway, Box Tunnel, and the Royal Albert Bridge. The SS Great Britain, abandoned in the Falkland Islands after serving as a warehouse, quarantine station, and later a coal hulk, was scuttled in 1937 only to be rescued and restored in the 1970s. Today, it is a beloved museum ship and one of Bristol's top attractions nearly 2 centuries after it was launched. Brunel is also credited with founding the modern town of Swindon, where a statue of him still stands, albeit now surrounded by a rather dilapidated shopping center that bears his name. While Brunel undoubtedly benefited from his father's guidance, his vision far surpassed that of his mentor. Many of his more quixotic ideas, once dismissed as fantasy, were brought to life. Before he even connected London and Bristol by rail, he had linked Britain and the United States by steamship. In doing so, he paved the way for the mass migration of tens of millions of Europeans to the Americas between 1840 and 1920. Though not all of his ventures were financially successful, every one of them reflected the audacity, flair, and visionary genius that made him one of the true icons of Victorian Britain. In 2002, he came second in a BBC nationwide poll of the 100 greatest Britons. So, what's your verdict on Isambard Kingdom Brunel? Was he a visionary genius, whose colossal ambitions forged the blueprint of Britain's modern infrastructure, or a perfectionist, whose relentless pursuit of the extraordinary often clashed with reality? Let us know in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching.